Now I'm going to start this game off by saying this. Kramnik had to have this game won in order to keep pace with Mickey Adams from England, who's playing really, really well the last few months. He played great in the Grand Prix for the FIDE series of tournaments for the next World Challenger in 2014. As we all know, this November, and I'm really psyched about it. Magnus Carlsen from Norway is going to be challenging Vishy Anand, the current champion. Can't wait for that. But anyway, let's get to it. Like I said, it's an exchange Grunfeld. I'm going to go a little quick. Pretty much standard Grunfeld. Knight takes, pawn takes, bishop to g7, bishop d3. Now I put those arrows in there because if the d pawn takes the c pawn, it looks like it's free, but it's not. Bishop takes the c pawn, check for black, and white loses. Rook to c1, queen to a5, queen to d2, standard stuff. Not only does it help protect the c pawn, but at the same time it protects the a pawn. C takes, queen takes. Now, reason why that pawn on d4 isn't free, if you see that bishop takes pawn, rook takes bishop on c8 check, winning the bishop, and white would be down a whole piece, and the game's over. Castle, knight f3, e6, bishop c4. Currently I have my Fritz 13 computer off screen, you can't see it. And right now it's showing about a quarter of a pawn advantage for white. I like white's position a lot right now, to tell you the truth. I mean, look at the development he has. And this is typical Grunfeld. You get behind a little bit, you get cramped as black. It's very popular at the Grandmaster level, especially at the elite player level. But I put those arrows up there for a reason, to show you how much space white has. It's really something. I mean, white's got a pretty commanding presence. Knight to c6, d5, e takes, bishop takes. That bishop's on a great square here. That bishop on d5. That's pretty commanding. And black has to do something about it. h6, probably to prevent the knight from coming in the future, or maybe even the bishop. On d2, castle, rook e8, rook b1, rook e7. It's about almost a half a point advantage for white. Rook f to c1. Now this looks really good right here. You've got white's got his rooks commanding down, one on an open file, one on a semi-open file. And that bishop on d5 is holding up the e4 pawn. So looks pretty good for white here. I like white's position a lot. It only shows him as a quarter of a point advantage, but it's got to be higher than that. At least it's easier to play. Bishop d6, bishop takes, f takes. Now I'm really surprised. If you look at the computer here, of course he's forced to take it, but I'm not sure if rook takes would be out of the question. Rook takes the b7 pawn, and then rook takes the e4 pawn. Maybe it's better with the f pawn. F takes, king to f1, starting getting your king up. It's getting towards the end of the middle game, and you're going to see the kings play somewhat of a huge role, like they usually do in endgames. After rook to d8, bishop b3. Now look at that rook. It's commanding that file. Rook to d3, knight d1, rook goes back. h4. You see a lot of that in Grandmaster games. I don't normally play it myself, but I think I should be studying Grandmaster games more. Maybe older games are good, but I think some of the newer games like this one are good. It's just as funny. There's ways to play, positions to play, how elite grandmasters do things, and it's very much like fashion. You'll see a super grandmasters pick up something for a while, then they move on to something else. It's really funny. It's very much like fashion. After h4, rook to f7, knight to f3, rook to d3, back again. Now the bishop goes to c5. That's a really good spot for that bishop, but look at that dark squared bishop for black. He's very commanding right there. Rook f to d7, doubling up on the d file. That's very, very good for black. It shows about a quarter of a pawn advantage for white, but black's come out of the situation he was in when I showed a few moves ago how backed up he was, which is typical in the Grunfeld. It looks like you're pressed against the wall, but over time you eventually work out of it. King e2, get your king in the game. Now the queens are off the board. Rook to c3, rook takes, bishop takes. It's still only quarter pawn advantage for white. I think black is holding his own very well here. Now you have to remember, Kramnik has to win this game in order to stay up with Mickey Adams in the tournament. I think Kramnik has won Dortmund, gosh, the last few years in a row. So it's not just about money. These guys are pretty set for money, even though I'm sure the money's good. It's like any other person, any other sport. These guys are so competitive, they want to always win. It's just in their blood and it's in their nature. It's why they're great players. g4, bishop f6, he backs the bishop up. Bishop to e3. I think in the end what he's trying to do is maybe get his bishop to c5, or maybe move it back here and then up. But he's trying to get on this diagonal right here, the a3 f8 diagonal. That's a really good spot for that bishop. King to g7, g5, pawn takes, bishop backs up. That stops the diagonal from the dark squared bishop for white to get on. And it's about a third of a pawn advantage. It doesn't change much. Bishop to d2, bishop to d8. Now they're fooling around with their dark squared bishops, trying to maneuver them around a little bit. Bishop to c3, king to g8. That one will surprise he backed it up. I'm surprised he didn't go here, even though the knight would check. If he went here, knight checks, and it forces the exchange of knights, and then bishop takes. That's probably what he didn't want. He wanted to keep the knight. Bishop to f6. That's a really good square. Now, as you can see, if the bishop on d8, black's bishop takes, the g-pawn takes, and then the next move for them shortly thereafter, pawn goes to e4, and those pawns are very, very commanding there. With that knight backing up the e-pawn, that really cramps black up, so you cannot take. Bishop to f6, he backs off. Knight to h2. Rook to h7. Knight to g4. King to f8. He wanted to get out of this check, obviously. King to f3. King to e8. King to g2. He wants to move his knight, so he's got to discard the h2 square. Rook to h4. King up. Now you'll see this quite often in endgames where the king plays a defensive role. Kind of an oxymoron, being that he's the one that always needs defending. He's defending his minor pieces and his pawns. You see that a lot in endgames. Rook to f7. f4. Now worth considering, I think, and this is a computer move, this isn't my move. Bishop to a1, which is really an odd move. Then after checks, f4. That's very strange. Rook to d7. White goes rook to h1, and there's a mate combination coming. He's threatening rook to h8 check. And then when the king has to move to f7, knight goes to h6 mate. That bishop is strangling the black king. He can't escape. So black checks, king to g2, black checks. Now right now on the computer you can't see it, but I just don't like to show the computer. That way you don't get to see the suggested moves. I think when you watch a lot of videos on YouTube that it's a good idea to pause the video and try to work out variations yourself. If you're going to go over Grandmaster games, it's good to do that. Or try to guess the next move. I do that quite a bit as well. Right now it's showing it at 0.00. Now you can't get any closer than that. It's dead even. King to f3, rook checks. King moves. Now it wouldn't have been mate if the king had moved here attacking the rook. It's not a mating net because the king can escape from here. It's a little different than before when the rook was on d7, cutting off the escape of the black king. King to g2, rook to d2 check, rook to f3, rook to d3. Now that's not a threefold repetition for those of you that are looking at this. It's only a twofold. King to e2, rook to g3, finally got in, rook to h4 guarding the knight, king to d7. Now look at this position here. This is very interesting. You've got a double minor piece rook ending with the majority of the pawns on both sides, on the opposite sides of the board. Very tough. Bishop to g7, knight to d4 check, king moves, king to c6. He's getting his king up in the action the best he can. Knight to e5, that's a really, really good spot for that knight. He attacks the g-pawn, and he just attacks a lot of good squares. King to b5. Now here's a situation here for black. Even though it's about it shows about 2/3 of a pawn advantage for white. But here's black's dilemma. He's got those pawns bearing down on him. They're coming. And we're going to see how black handles it. Rook to e2, excuse me, h2, rook to e3, rook checks, king to a4, here comes the black king, bishop to f8. Now it's guarding a couple of good squares there. That bishop's got a lot of scope now. It's cutting off some of the squares of the black king. It's in a good position to, just in general, to be in the center of the board. Good spot. Eventually, you might want to go to d6, and then when the knight moves, go back to e5, which is a really good spot for him. Interesting might have been, instead of bishop to f8, knight takes, rook takes, bishop takes, bishop takes, rook takes, king to a3. But almost a pawn advantage for white, even though technically he's up a pawn. He's not quite up a pawn in score. So black's really doing okay there. Bishop to f8. Now here's where Fabiano Caruana stumbles. Now I remember watching the game, and he was in tremendous time trouble. Right up to move 40, which was the time control. And towards the end of the game, which is coming up here, he was in tremendous time pressure. Fabiano Caruana is black. Vladimir Kramnik is white. Here's where he stumbles. Bishop to a5. What he should have done instead, I think it had a little more chance for him, is rook takes, rook to b4 check, king to a5, knight takes, king to a6. And it's just about even in score. 0.07 advantage for white, which is nothing. I think that was his best chance. But instead he went bishop to a5, which caused this sequence. Knight takes, rook takes, bishop to d6, rook to takes b7 was interesting. And after bishop to b6, bishop to d6, with a little over a pawn advantage for white. After bishop to d6, knight to f5. Now I'll go back to what I was talking about earlier about Kramnik having to win this game in order to keep pace with Mickey Adams from England. And Fabiano knows this. Under normal circumstances, I think this game would have been drawn either right around in here or just shortly before this. But Kramnik thinks he has nothing to lose, and he doesn't. Unless he wins this game, he cannot keep pace with Mickey Adams. Bishop to e5. That's a really good spot for that bishop. He commands a lot of good squares. He helps with the g-pawn towards queening. The knight's going to help the pawn. Even though I'll tell you the truth, it looks very bad for black here. I'm surprised the computer only gives it a tiny advantage, 0.17, which we might as well say it's even. At this point, I think Fabiano, even with his error earlier, has a good chance to draw this. Knight to c3, or excuse me, e3 check, king to e2, knight to f5, discovered check with the rook, king to f2, bishop b6 check. Now I think black's coming back in this game, even though it shows a tiny advantage for white. I mean, if I'm white in this situation here, I've got the rook bearing down on me. I've got the black knight coming down on e3 and g3. I've got the dark squared bishop bearing down. It's not so simple. Now, I want you to pause the video here, because I think Kramnik makes a very, very good move. So pause the video and try to figure out what Kramnik's going to do here. I'll give you a second. He takes the bishop with the rook. He sacrifices the exchange. Those pieces around his king were just too much. Now his dark squared bishop, after pawn takes, basically rules the world. Now it shows on the computer basically dead even. Even though white is down the exchange, he's dead even. So that means any tiny mistake by black, he's doomed. Knight to f8. Of course, he saw this. Kramnik, you know, he sees everything. I don't care if he's older. He's still an elite world-class player. King to a3. Interesting might have been, I think the best option for black at this point would bring the king back over towards his pawns. But he went a3. Knight takes e6. King takes a2. And here come the white pawns. It shows a one pawn advantage for white. He's down the exchange. Now look at the situation here. Connected pass pawns, and black's pawns are doubled on the b file. Yeah, it's easier to play white, that's for certain. This is Fabiano's to lose. g6, here comes the pawn. Rook to c4, trying to bring a rook over to help. King to d4, or excuse me, knight to d4. Knight to h6. Interesting might have been knight takes and g7. Rook to c2 check. King to f1. Rook to c1 check. King to g2. Just going back and forth with that. That might have been worth looking at. After knight to h6, just for whatever it's worth department, if rook had taken, bishop takes, king to b3, g7, with a huge advantage for white, of course. After knight to h6, g7, king to f3 was worth looking at. Then after rook to c5, bishop to g7, knight to g8. After pawn to g7, Fabiano Caruana stumbles again. The move he should make, rook to c5. Huge mistake. To give you an idea, white was up about a pawn. Now it's about a pawn and 3/4 advantage for white, maybe a little bit higher. King to f3 was probably the move. Then after rook to c5, bishop to g7, knight to g8. After rook to he should have went, instead of rook to c5, rook to c8, king to f3, rook to g8, f5. That's about a half a pawn advantage for white. I think Fabiano at this point could draw it. Now after rook to c5, which is not a huge blunder, but it's a pretty big error for black, Kramnik stumbles. Knight to e6, ruining the position. You're never going to see this, where world-class players make two huge errors in a row. Fabiano with his error rook to c5, and then Kramnik stumbles with knight to e6. Now I remember watching the game live, and I think at this point, it's a catch-22. When your opponent, in this case Caruana, is very, very low on time, he's almost playing on the increment, you don't want to give too much time when you're thinking. And it's kind of a catch-22. Do you move quickly even though you do have time? I think that's what happened to Kramnik. Instead of knight to e6, I think knight to f5 would have been a huge advantage for white. Well over 2 pawns. It basically ruined his position. And after knight to g8, knight to d6, and black's in a world of hurt at this point. I mean, you're looking at the pawn's guarding the bishop here. Bishop's guarding the pawn. This knight is stuck here. It's a good position for white. After knight to e6, what I think put Fabiano back in drawing chances, rook to c8, knight to f8. Now there you are, cutting off the rook from the queening square. b5, f5, rook to c2 check. Might as well just start checking. What else can you do? King to f3, and Fabiano stumbles again in time pressure. About a week prior to this game, Fabiano for the first time reached 2,800 rating. And I'll tell you the truth, there's a reason why there's very few guys that have reached 2,800. It's incredibly hard to get there, and then when you get there, it's so incredibly hard to keep it. He moves rook to c1. What he should have done was b4. I think that was his last chance to make it. After rook to c1, f6, here comes the pawns. Rook to f1 check. King to e4. If king had gone to e2, rook to f5, knight to g6. After king to e4, knight to g8. This is a crazy endgame. I remember watching it, and it was exciting to watch. Fabiano trying desperately to draw, and Kramnik, former world champion, doing everything he can to win the game, to keep pace with Mickey Adams. King to d5. Here comes the white king. Finally in the game. b4, knight to h7, and b3, king to e6. Here comes the white king. Knight finally takes. Bishop takes. Interesting would have been if knight takes, rook to g1, queens, rook takes, knight takes, b2, which is a dead draw. After bishop takes, rook to g1, bishop to g5. Now I think instead knight to g5 was worth looking at, blocking off the rook, and after b2, queens, and then queens. Fabiano Caruana finally makes his last mistake. Huge blunder. He plays rook takes g5. Now this is going to be a long scenario, and this is computer generated, so I'll go through it very quickly. So instead of rook takes g5, it's b2, queens, queens. I won't go through it all. Queen to a8, king takes, takes, queen checks, king to b2. You kind of get the idea of what's happening here. King to a3, and it ends up a scenario, another 20 moves, basically this. And this could have went on forever. But unfortunately, Fabiano played rook takes g5. Now, he miscalculated. He figures after knight takes, he can queen. but he can't. Because if he goes pawn, he missed that after knight to e4, pawn queens, knight checks. So after knight takes g5, Fabiano Caruana resigned. It was a great game. I feel bad for Fabiano, but pressure is pressure is pressure. Kramnik, the long-term, cool, under pressure veteran, pulls it off. So folks, that ends this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Hopefully there'll be games coming up in the next few days as I go through my games I play at the US Open. I played really well for my rating. I'm just under 1600. And in the US Open, you don't play people in their own section. You play everybody. And so I've got a lot of high-rated players that I played. And I did pretty well, considering the rating difference in a lot of my play. Anyway, folks, if you think chess is just a game, you're not playing it right. And I would please, if you would subscribe. And also, if you could kind of tell your friends on YouTube here about my videos. I haven't been getting a lot of hits, and I'm hoping to get a lot more views on this as well. So if you pass the word along to some of your friends maybe on YouTube that like to watch chess, I would appreciate it if you would. Okay, everybody, take care. Bye-bye.